January 1883, dry Willow Flats, Colorado territory. The wind rolled off the Sangre de Cristo peaks like it meant to kill something. It came down shrieking through the bare cottonwoods, hurling dust and old snow across the empty basin. There wasn't a bird in the sky, nor a soul on the road. Just the hush of brittle branches knocking and the long groan of wood shifting in the cold. Martha stood in the doorway of a cabin that hadn't known warmth since her husband rode off 7 weeks back. He'd left with 2 rifles, 1 horse, and a satchel full of good intentions. Said he'd find work down near Trinidad, maybe in the rail yards or digging or in the hills beyond. Promised to send money. Promised to come back. He hadn't. The baby was near silent in her arms, not for lack of hunger, but for sheer exhaustion. 5 days old, no name yet. Just a whisper of breath and pale purpled feet that wouldn't warm no matter how long Martha held him to her chest. She'd wrapped him in the last piece of clean muslin, tucked him under her shawl, and still he shook like something half frozen, half forgotten. Behind her, the rest of the children sat on the floor with their legs tucked up beneath their shirts, trying to trap the heat of their own bellies. They didn't cry anymore. Crying was for days when there was enough to hope for. While the eldest, that barely ate, kept glancing toward the stove like it might light itself if he stared hard enough. Nothing left to burn but a busted chair and the Bible, and Martha wasn't ready to give up either. She stepped outside because it was colder in than out somehow. The house held stillness too thick to breathe. Out here at least the air moved. Snow crusted under her boots. The sky was white above white, no horizon, no end. Just a blank vastness. Her knuckles had cracked from the cold, and every breath she took hurt going down. She shifted the baby against her and whispered it before she could stop herself. "Sir, my baby is cold." She hadn't known she'd said it aloud until she saw the cowboy freeze. He'd come up the ridge, slow walking beside his horse like he wasn't sure where he was headed. Coat stiff with frost, beard thick with ice, and eyes the color of a dry riverbed, pale and unreadable. When she spoke, he stopped like he'd stepped into a memory he hadn't meant to revisit. One hand still resting on the saddle horn, the other half lifted in surprise like the words had struck him square in the chest. He didn't say anything, just stood there staring at the child in her arms. The wind passed between them, cold as judgment. She almost turned away, almost apologized, but her legs wouldn't move. Her tongue tasted of blood and silence. The baby didn't stir. And the man, he dropped the reins, stepped forward once, twice, then again, like crossing some line he hadn't crossed in years. Martha didn't know his name, didn't ask, just watched him kneel slowly like the cold had taken hold of his bones and reached toward the child with a gentleness that didn't belong out here. "You got a fire?" he asked. "No wood," she said. He nodded once, jaw set tight, then stood. Said nothing more. Walked to his horse, unstrapped something from the back, a canvas bundle heavy, hauled it over his shoulder, and followed her inside without waiting for permission. The children didn't make a sound when he came in, just looked up with wide, hollow eyes as he dropped the bundle beside the stove and pulled free a load of dry split wood. By the time the fire caught, the baby had begun to cry, weak but clear. The man didn't speak again, just fed the fire, then stood by it like he belonged to it, as if the heat was a thing he'd once known well. Martha sank to the floor, baby still pressed to her chest, and watched the frost melt from her fingertips. The room smelled of smoke, sap, and something else, something clean like hope that hadn't yet been used up. She looked up once. The man was watching the fire, not her. And still she whispered, not quite believing herself, "Thank you." He gave the smallest of nods. Then very quietly he said, "Name's Elijah." And that was all. The baby nursed in broken rhythm while the fire crackled loud in the hush of the cabin. The girls curled closer to it, 4 little bodies scooting inch by inch until they nearly lay on top of one another. The boy Will kept glancing toward the stranger, measuring the shape of him, weighing whether a man like that meant harm or help. Elijah took off his coat, but not his hat. His shirt was threadbare at the elbows, patched twice on the shoulder. He leaned against the log wall like a man used to waiting. Martha rocked the baby, shifting him to the other side, and listened to the wind beat itself against the seams of the house. "You headed anywhere in particular?" she asked. He took a long breath before answering. "Nowhere pressing." His voice had gravel in it, the kind that came from too many cold nights and not enough conversation. She nodded. That was answer enough. The fire caught stronger now, and the heat began to lift the raw bite from the air. It brought with it the sour smell of old milk and unwashed bodies, but no one flinched. Warmth forgave a great deal. Elijah pulled a tin from his saddlebag and set it near the flames. Coffee, by the smell of it. He didn't ask to share, just poured a cup, then handed it to her without speaking. Martha hesitated only a moment. The mug was warm in her palms. She drank, and it scalded her mouth, but she didn't stop. She hadn't had real coffee in months. The baby fell asleep against her chest. After a while, Elijah crouched beside the stove and looked at her, not bold but not hiding either. "What's his name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Ain't got one yet." He nodded, then looked at the children tucked in tight behind her. "Yours, all of 'em. Where's their father?" She stared at the fire a long time. "Said he'd be back before the first snow." Elijah didn't ask another thing. Just sat back on his heels and looked at the floor like it held some answer he'd been looking for most his life. Later he stepped outside to tend his horse, and Martha took the chance to clean up what she could. She wiped the girls' faces with melted snow, tied back hair with scraps of cloth, and set will to breaking what little kindling was left. She wasn't sure if Elijah was staying, but something in her moved like a door opening just enough to feel the draft of something different. He came back with 2 rabbits slung over one shoulder, frozen stiff, laid them on the table, and pulled a skinning knife from his belt. Will's eyes lit up. The girls watched from behind their mother. "You know how to gut one?" Elijah asked the boy. Will stood like someone had just handed him a badge of honor. "I seen Pa do it." "Well," Elijah said, "best way to learn's to try." They worked in silence, save for the sounds of knife through hide, bone cracking, and fire hissing low. It wasn't polite, but it was familiar, and that made it welcome. Martha cooked the meat slow in the cast-iron pot, adding the last of the dried onion and a pinch of salt she'd been saving for Christmas. The smell filled the cabin and made her stomach ache with how good it was. When the stew was done, they sat around the fire bowls in laps. No prayers, just hungry mouths. Elijah ate little, watching the children with a quiet that bordered on reverence. When the girls started to doze full and warm for the first time in days, he stood. "I'll sleep in the lean-to," he said. "Horses tied close. You need anything, just knock." She didn't argue. Only said, "There's a blanket in the chest." He didn't take it. Just tipped his hat and stepped into the dark. Martha stood a long time at the window, looking out at nothing. The baby lay tucked in the crook of her arm, breathing steady now. There was no sound but the wind and the low breathing of her children. She didn't know the man's story, but he'd come when she needed someone most, and he hadn't asked for a thing. She sat down near the fire, too tired to think, too weary to sleep. But something in her had shifted. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the absence of despair. Subscribe and let the trail unfold, one story at a time. Morning came in quiet shades of gray, the kind of light that makes no promises. The wind had gone still. Not gone, just waiting. Martha rose before the children stirred. Her joints ached and her hands moved like they remembered pain. She laid the baby in the bed's warmest spot beside the smallest girl and stepped outside, pulling the shawl tight across her shoulders. Elijah was already up, brushing down the horse with slow, even strokes. His breath steamed in the air. He didn't look at her right away, just kept to his work like it grounded him. "You always up this early?" she asked. He shrugged. "Sleep don't come easy." She knew that kind of sleep, the kind where dreams were worse than the waking, where silence pressed on the chest like a stone. She stepped to the side of the cabin, took the dented kettle, and scooped snow into it until her fingers stung. She held it up without a word, and Elijah took it, carried it inside, set it on the stove. It was the beginning of something. Not quite trust, not yet comfort, but a rhythm. The next days passed in a slow thaw. He didn't leave. He didn't explain why. He hauled in deadfall from the ravine, chopped it to firewood, and stacked it neat. "When we'll ask questions," Elijah answered. Not with warmth, but with patience. When one of the girls cried over a burned finger or a torn hem, he stepped outside, gave space. When Martha stitched socks by candlelight, he sat nearby, not speaking, not staring, just being. They spoke in pieces. She told him about her father's sod farm back in Kansas, how she'd come west at 17 with a man twice her age, hoping it meant something better. How it hadn't. He told her about Arkansas, about a brother dead from cholera, a mother gone to fever, and a stretch of time he'd spent working cattle until one winter snapped too hard and killed most of the herd. After that, he said, I just kept moving. "What are you looking for?" He didn't answer right away. Then someplace quiet, where I ain't someone to be feared. That struck her, because she hadn't feared him. Not once. Not even when he'd first stepped into the cabin. Maybe because she had too little left to lose. Or maybe because something in him mirrored the part of her that kept standing even when the ground gave out. It was 3 nights later, during a snowstorm that sounded like wolves clawing at the walls, when the baby began to cry in earnest. Not hunger. Not cold. Something deeper, wetter. Martha held him close, rocked him hard, trying to calm the heat burning off his tiny body. Elijah came in without knocking. He didn't speak, just saw her face, the way her hands trembled, and stepped forward. "He's burning up," she said. "I don't know what's wrong." Elijah didn't pretend to, but he set a pot to boil, helped her strip the baby down, and wrapped him in a cloth soaked with snowmelt. The boy wailed, red-faced and furious, but Martha didn't stop. They took turns. Through the night, through the worst of the wind, the girls cried from their beds. Who stayed up trying to be brave, fetching water, stoking the fire. By dawn the fever broke. The baby slept, damp curls stuck to his brow. Martha sank to the floor, back against the wall, the kind of tired that lives in the bones. Elijah sat across from her knees, drawn up. Their eyes met. He looked like a man who'd been through war. She reached across the space between them and touched the back of his hand. It was the first time, and she said, "Thank you." He didn't smile, but something in his face softened like snow finally giving way to earth beneath. Neither of them moved. Outside the wind quieted. Inside a stillness took hold, not emptiness, but the kind that leaves room for something to grow. The days stretched long, folded in on one another, marked not by clocks, but by the needs of small children and the rhythms of cold. Snow deepened around the cabin, turning the world to white silence. No one came. No one left. Elijah stayed. He made no claim to the space, asked nothing in return. He fixed the door hinge that always sagged, mended the loose board near the stove where mice had been slipping in. When the cow went dry, he fashioned a snare and brought back squirrels skinned and cleaned. Once a wild turkey. Another time a bag of cornmeal and lard traded down the road, he said, with a trapper who owed him. Martha never asked how much he gave or what he kept for himself. She just made the biscuits. Most nights the children clung to her. But now and then one of the girls would crawl into Elijah's lap and fall asleep against his chest, arms flopped like little wings. He never moved them, never shifted, just sat quiet and still until they stirred on their own. It startled her how easily he belonged among them. Even Will had started to copy him, mimicking the way he walked with his shoulders squared, how he sharpened a blade with slow, careful stroke. Martha noticed. She noticed a lot these days. How Elijah always offered her the last bite of food without making a show of it. How he turned away when she changed the baby. How he looked out the window more than he looked at her, like he was afraid of getting used to anything. One evening she found him mending one of her boots. His hands were calloused and sure, but gentle with the leather. "You don't have to do that," she said. He didn't look up. "I know." She leaned against the doorway. "You always fix what's broken." A long pause. "No, but I try not to break more than I mend." That stuck with her. The kind of truth that don't need explaining. Later that week, Will brought in a letter from the fence post. The paper was smudged and water-stained, the handwriting too neat to be her husband's. Martha opened it slow. It was from a woman in Trinidad, the wife of a man her husband had worked for. She wrote kindly, but plain said he'd left the job 3 weeks in, took a payout, and rode off. No one's seen him since. No mention of them. No forwarding word. Just silence. Martha folded the letter twice and set it in the drawer beneath the tea tins. She said nothing. Made supper. Tucked in the children. Sat by the fire. When Elijah returned from the lean to brushing snow from his shoulders, she looked up at him like she meant to speak. But the words didn't come. He saw it. Something in her face told him. He knelt by the stove, poured her the last of the coffee, and handed it over without asking. That night, when she lay beside the baby, she did not cry. She just stared at the rafters and thought about how still the house had become. Not empty, not hollow. Still like a held breath. The kind of stillness before something shifts, before someone makes a choice. A week later, the thaw began. Not all at once, but in little signs, the icicles dripping slow from the eaves, the snow turning crust soft underfoot. Birds started to return, not many, just a pair of jays squabbling in the cottonwoods, but enough to remind everyone that winter didn't last forever. Elijah began spending longer hours outside. He cleared the trail from the cabin to the well. He built a windbreak from pine boughs and scrap wood for the chickens that had barely survived the cold. When Martha asked if he planned to head on come spring, he only said, "Don't know yet," and kept splitting log. Some days she caught herself waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch. One morning he was late returning from his ride to check the traps. Too late. The sun passed its peak and dipped low before she heard the horse at the fence line. She ran outside, heart quick, the baby against her hip. He wasn't hurt, but his face was dark with something she hadn't seen before, not anger. Worry. He handed her a folded note. It was from Thomas Gentry, the land agent in town. Plain words. A claim had been filed. Her husband's name was still on the deed. And now a man in Trinidad had petitioned to buy the land cheap. Said the place was abandoned. No evidence of payment. No man present. The letter gave them 14 days to dispute it. She read it twice. Then again. Elijah didn't speak, not at first. "Then if you go to town, you'll need proof of claim. Something to show you've held the land." "I've got no papers," she said. He took them with him. "Then you'll need to speak. Stand in front of whoever's making the call. Show 'em you're still here." Her hands trembled, though she balled them in her skirt to hide it. "And if they say I've got no right, they'd be wrong." That night she barely slept. Her husband's name still carried weight, and her name, well, it never did stand alone. Not legally. But she thought about the 5 pairs of shoes lined up by the hearth, the fresh chopped wood stacked shoulder high, the food jarred in the pantry, the hand-sewn curtains, the fact that no man had fed or housed or saved those children through the cold but her. And Elijah. In the quiet before dawn she rose and lit the lamp. packed a sack with bread, dried rabbit, and boiled eggs. She dressed in her warmest clothes, tied her hair back. Will stirred on the floor pallet. Ma, you goin'? She nodded. Just for the day. Elijah's staying with you. The boy didn't argue. Just looked past her to the door, already trusting the man who'd never once tried to take what wasn't his. Elijah stood waiting beside the horse, reins in hand. He'd saddled it before she asked. You ever spoken in front of a judge? He asked. She shook her head. You'll be fine, he said. And she believed him. The ride to town was 6 hours through melting snow and slick trails. Her legs cramped. Her hands froze. But she didn't turn back. By the time she stood in front of the clerk's desk, her voice was steady. She spoke plain and slow. Told them she'd kept the land, raised 5 children on it, tended it through sickness, storms, and silence, and that if a man wanted to buy it out from under her, he'd have to look her in the eye and say she wasn't worth the dirt she stood on. They let her keep it. Didn't make it easy, but they didn't take it. When she stepped out into the thin, watery sun, she felt taller than she had in years. She rode home sore and tired, hands shaking on the reins. The cabin came into view just as the sky went gold at the edges. Smoke from the chimney, children's laughter carried thin across the clearing. Elijah was on the porch, watching. She didn't speak as she dismounted. Didn't need to. He looked at her like he already knew, and in the quiet space between them she reached out and took his hand. Not bold. Not desperate. Just sure. The snow had melted in streaks along the hillside, leaving behind patches of wet earth and last year's grass, flat and yellowed but holding on. Spring had not fully arrived, but it had begun to hint. The air smelled different, of thawed soil, of smoke that lingered without biting. Martha hung wet linens on the line while the girls played nearby. The baby named Jacob now slept in a sling across her chest, his mouth slack, cheeks warm and pink. She hummed to herself without knowing the tune, something old her mother used to sing back when the world was smaller. Inside the cabin, Elijah was repairing the broken leg of the table. He'd already fixed the roof, patched the door frame, and carved new handles for the kitchen drawers. Not because she asked. He just did. You fix everything you see? She'd asked one night. No, he'd said. Only what I'd miss if it broke again. That stuck. He didn't speak much of the future, not even now. But he'd begun keeping his saddle inside, unstrapped his rifle each night, laid it by the door like someone who meant to stay. They talked more in glances than words. Trust had built itself quiet between chores and meals, in the long stillness of winter nights, in the weight of shared work. And now that the worst had passed, there was no denying it any more. They had become something together, not by vow, not by law, but by the slow weaving of 2 lives into one rhythm. One afternoon Will asked the question no one else had dared. You gonna marry my man? Martha looked up from the basin, heart jumping. Elijah didn't blink. That for your mother to decide. Will grinned, teeth missing in places. She likes you. Elijah nodded. I like her too. Will accepted this like he did most things, plain and true, then returned to his task. Later, as dusk painted the fields in blue and rust, Elijah brought out a small box from his saddlebag. He didn't offer it with speech or fanfare, just set it on the table after supper while the children were busy with their wooden blocks. She opened it slow. Inside was a ring, not new, not polished. The band was thin silver with a turquoise stone that had seen time. The kind of ring someone had worn before. The kind someone had loved. It was my mother's, he said. She gave it to the only girl I ever thought I'd marry. But that didn't hold. Martha looked up. She gave it back, he said. Told me I had a good heart, but too much storm in me. Martha's voice caught in her throat. And now? I ain't looking to be saved. And I ain't asking for promises you ain't ready to make. But if you want this, If you want me, I'll build whatever life you say." She stared at the ring, the worn silver, the way it had waited through so many years for another hand. Her fingers closed over it slow and sure. "I ain't afraid of storms," she said. "Been living through one for years." Elijah reached for her hand. No rush. No claim. Just that quiet steadiness that had come to mean everything. They didn't speak of weddings or dresses or churches. Just began from that moment living as if they'd already made the vow. And the children, well, they didn't question it. They saw it in the way he taught Will to whittle, the way he lifted the girls to pick berries from the high bramble, the way he held Jacob like he'd been made for that exact weight. As spring broke fully open, Martha planted seeds with her hands in the dirt, and a growing sense that this place, this land, this life had become hers in a way no paper or law ever could name. One evening she and Elijah stood at the fence line as the sun dropped behind the hills. "I think I'd like to add another room," she said. "Maybe one with windows that catch the morning." He nodded. "I can do that." She smiled. "I know." In the distance the baby cried. She turned to go, but Elijah caught her hand, held it a second longer than needed. Not to stop her, just to feel her warmth, to know she was real, to remind them both what had been built from almost nothing. The room went up slow. Elijah started with a line drawn in the dirt, pasted out from the back wall of the cabin. He showed Will how to set a corner post, how to notch the beams. Every plank was measured twice, every nail hammered straight, and still the whole thing leaned. Just a little, not enough to matter, just enough to remind you it was made by hand. Martha kept the baby on her hip and swept sawdust from the stoop. The girls brought water from the creek in tin buckets, splashing half of it before they made it back. But the point wasn't the help. It was the sound of them, their laughter echoing off the woods like something sacred. By the time the walls were up, the days had lengthened. The air held warmth, the promise of green. Chickens scratched in the thawed yard. A doe with twin fawns began passing near the cabin each dawn, like she'd decided this was safe ground now. Sometimes Martha would stand still in the doorway, holding Jacob tight and just listening, not for danger, not out of fear, but to let it sink in. This quiet, this peace. One morning a rider came. A man on a brown horse, tall in the saddle coat, too fine for the road. Elijah saw him first. He stepped off the porch, arms loose at his sides, but his stance told another story. The man pulled up, short eyes sweeping the place. "You Martha Albright?" She nodded, coming to the doorway. "I am." He dismounted, brushed the dust from his coat. "I'm from the county office," he said. "Hear about your homestead claim. There's been a dispute filed." Martha felt her throat tighten. That was settled, was the man said. "But now your husband's returned. Claims abandonment was never his intent. Says he's here to take back what's his." Elijah didn't move. Martha stepped forward, slow. "He left us over 3 months ago. I rode to town, stood before the clerk myself." The man nodded. "I know, and I've seen the record. But technically your name was never added to the deed. If he contests it in court—" Elijah's voice came low. "He here now?" The man shook his head. "No, but he's coming." That night, after the children slept, Martha sat by the fire, hands in her lap. Elijah carved something by lantern light, not looking at her, but waiting. "I can't let him take this," she said. "He won't." "You don't know that." "I do." His knife slowed. "You don't have to run from this." "I'm not afraid." He looked up then. "Good." She hesitated. "But I don't want to fight. Not in front of the children. You won't have to raise your voice. I'll be here." And she believed him. 2 days later her husband rode in. His coat was frayed at the cuffs, his face thinner, meaner. He looked at the cabin like it was still his, like nothing had changed. Martha stepped outside before he could speak. Elijah stood beside her. Her husband's eyes shifted. Saw the new room, the children healthy, the fence rebuilt, the woodpile stacked. "This place is mine," he said. "Still got my name on the papers." "No," Martha said. "It's ours. And you gave it up." "I never said—" "You left." Her voice did not shake. "You didn't write. You didn't send for your children. You abandoned us. And now you want to own what you wouldn't protect." He looked at Elijah. "So this what you traded me for, some drifter?" Martha stepped forward. "No. This is the man who stayed." The silence cut deeper than any raised voice. Her husband stared long, his pride-bruised fists curling at his sides, but Elijah didn't flinch. He stood still as an oak. The man looked once more at the cabin, the fields, the life he'd walked away from, then turned his horse and rode out without another word. Afterward, Martha sat on the steps and breathed for the first time in days. Elijah joined her, handed her a mug of coffee. "You did that," he said. "Not me." She nodded, eyes still on the road. "I know." The wind rustled through the trees. A bird called low and steady. The air smelled like dirt and pine and spring. Elijah took her hand in his, rough against rough, warm and sure. They sat together as the sun slipped down the porch beneath them solid, and for the first time the land truly felt like theirs. The rain came soft in early May, soaking the earth without hurry. It left the grass taller by morning green where it had been brown. The girls danced barefoot, and the puddles' skirts hiked high while Will dragged logs down from the ridge behind the house, strong now in a way he hadn't been before. Elijah built the porch roof longer so she could sit with the baby and watch the weather come in without getting wet. He didn't say much while he worked, but he'd stop now and then, brush her shoulder as he passed, or press his palm to the top of Jacob's head like it was a kind of blessing. The baby had begun to laugh, short, sudden bursts that startled everyone into grins. He favored Elijah when he cried, would calm in his arms, burrow into the crook of his elbow like that was where he'd always belonged. Martha watched the two of them sometimes from across the room, watched the way Elijah's hard edges softened when he rocked the boy, the way he'd taken to calling him Little Hawk when no one else was listening. The new room was nearly finished. Wood floors, 2 wide windows. She planned to move the bed there once the caulking dried, have a place of her own where the morning sun spilled in and the house didn't creak above her head. Elijah offered to build shelves for her sewing, said he could make a desk if she wanted to write letters. She hadn't written anyone in years. One night after the children were asleep, she brought out the ring. She hadn't worn it yet, hadn't even taken it from the box. She set it down on the table between them. Elijah was sharpening his knife, but he stopped when he saw it. "I've been thinking," she said. "A lot of folks call it marriage when a man claims a woman, puts his name on her, says she's his. But I don't need that." Elijah nodded, slow, waiting. "I want it to be something we choose," he said. "Not because of the law, not because someone says we ought to, but because it's ours." He didn't smile, but his eyes held something brighter than joy, something steadier. "You want me to say vows?" he asked. She shook her head. "I want you to promise me you'll stay, not just here, with us. When it's hard, when it's dull, when it's just chopping wood and washing diapers and listening to chickens squawk. I can do that. I don't need anything more." Elijah reached across the table and took the ring, slipped it onto her finger without ceremony, without a word. It fit. He held her hand in his rough calluses, brushing her skin, and she knew deep in her chest that this was the kind of promise that didn't wear out, didn't crack with use, the kind you lived, not said. The next morning the children found them out on the porch watching the fog roll off the hills. The girls climbed into their laps. Will brought a bucket of peas and started shelling them cross-legged in the dirt. Jacob slept on Elijah's chest, arms spread wide, his mouth open. There was no music, no witness but the birds and the wind, but it was enough. The land had held them through winter, had tested them, had taken what was weak and left only what could stand. Now it gave something back. In the days that followed, Martha planted beans in neat rows. Elijah helped the neighbor down the ridge raise a new barn, traded labor for seed. The girls began learning to read. Will built a rabbit hutch. Jacob learned to crawl, then to stand, legs wobbling like a new calf. The porch filled with muddy boots and laughter. They built a life from scrap and silence, from the bones of sorrow and the muscle of hope. And when Martha sat in the doorway sewing by hand while the sun fell across her lap, she no longer thought of what she had lost, only of what she had built, with her hands, with her heart, with the man who stayed. If this story held you, subscribe for the ones ahead.